for being here. I hope I know most of you if you're all in RenCo. If not, nice to meet you. I'm Stan. I'm an attorney. I guess my formal title is compliance counsel at Weedmaps, but I pretty much do a little bit of everything at Weedmaps. I'm a weed lawyer, I guess. Went to the University of Chicago, went to Harvard Law School. I got my PhD in philosophy at Berkeley. Before that, that was my first career. It failed, obviously. Maybe Pete will show me the way to my third career. We'll see. So Pete Huang here is our guest tonight. He is also one of our own. He's from RenCo. I mean, part of RenCo. That's true. And the CEO of Airtable unfortunately wasn't available because Jen's still working on our brand. But Pete agreed to. Just kidding. Pete agreed to talk to us, and he's got some pretty awesome stories. So I hope we can kind of dig in tonight and enjoy ourselves. He's the 15th employee. He was the 15th employee at Airtable. I assume everyone knows what Airtable is, but hopefully we don't have to give a little introduction of that later. Before that, he was at McKinsey. And he's currently, well, I think he's currently between roles in some fashion, but for quite a bit, he was running kind of a one-man show, heading up strategy and ops at Airtable and doing all sorts of stuff he's going to tell us about. But very recently, he decided that wasn't enough accomplishment in his roughly 16 years of life. So now he's transitioning to a growth PM role at Airtable, which sounds pretty exciting, especially as Airtable continues to scale. I think I mentioned before at Airtable, he was at McKinsey for a number of years, and he's also the commissioner of the SF Public Library, which honestly, I don't know anything about, so maybe he'll tell us a little bit about that. He interned at Palantir and Nielsen, and he's also been an advisor for some nonprofit startups. Not bad. I think the only ding on Pete's resume is that he went to Northwestern. I went to the University of Chicago, so I'll be lording.
Where fun goes to die, right, Stan?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Where God drinks coffee and fun goes to die. No, Northwestern's a good school, guys. So let's get started. I think, like I said, I think everybody knows a little bit about Airtable. So I think more interesting would be sort of to dig right into sort of your journey, your personal journey there. And I think you have a pretty interesting story about how you found it in the first place. So maybe you could sort of start off telling us how you did find Airtable and what you were doing specifically before.
Yeah, totally. Thanks, Dan. It's great to have everyone here. This story starts this was probably early 2017. So I was in Chicago after school. I was at McKinsey and knew pretty quickly that I was going to end up moving back home to the Bay Area in some capacity. I'm from Pleasanton, which is like 45 minutes to an hour east of San Francisco. But I had no idea what was going on in tech in Silicon Valley and anything. And so my grand move was to sign up for Twitter and see what was going on there. And so what happened was there was a Saturday where there were like 3 VC associates who were like, they tweet a ton. And so they were talking about Airtable. And I remember searching for Airtable on Twitter, and you just saw, it was so remarkable. Like you saw this stream of tweets that was just pure love for the product, which I thought was super fun. And so, okay, this team is onto something. They were like 10 to 12 people at the time, right? It was like very, very small. And at the same time, I'd gotten connected to someone who was very ingrained in Silicon Valley. He was some VP of product at some company. And he said, you know what, the thing you got to do is just talk to as many people as, just reach out and see what happens, right? And I ended up cold emailing Howie, our CEO, off of that advice. Turns out that, I cold emailed Howie and then we had a coffee chat and everything. Then mid-interview process, it turns out I found out that the guy that I've been talking to, this VP of product, was our chief product officer's roommate. And he had actually watched Howie and Andrew, the chief product officer, literally build Airtable from the ground up in 2012. And it just felt like, I was doing this like structured job search of like certain types of companies and talking to Google and all that kind of stuff. And then this like random thing with Airtable. And it just felt like in those moments that the universe had aligned a little bit. And so, yeah, I ended up joining as the second customer success manager, but ended up doing a bunch of generalist things. Ended up being about number 15 or so.
Yeah, that's a pretty sort of magical story. One I think a lot of us wish or probably many of you has happened to many of you, not me. I wish that's happened to me. But that's pretty awesome. And could you tell us a little bit about what you were doing consulting specifically? Did it have anything to do with Airtable, and what sort of companies were you looking at?
Yeah, it was completely unrelated to the point where like I don't know how it happened, honestly. In the consulting world, I fell in with the, and everyone prepare yourselves for the most exciting thing. I was doing IT cost cutting in health insurance companies. And there was just a roaming group of folks who were traveling all over the country, talking to all these big payers and public health agencies, helping them cut their IT costs. And I somehow like fell in with them and worked with them for about 1.5 years or 2 years. And so what was funny is that I actually kind of loved it. It was super dry, super boring stuff. But I just thought there was something interesting that it was like I could feel the market moving. You know, everyone talked about like digital transformation, whatever. Like I remember feeling the heat of that back in 2015. I thought that was an interesting trend. And so when I was coming out of consulting, I was like, okay, I'm going to search for startups, whatever, but like IT infrastructure, like just like very technical, non-consumer facing, no brand value for the average person type of company. And I ended up finding those, and I remember talking to like Thousand Eyes and like Zscaler and all these companies that were doing security and databases and networking and all that kind of stuff. And then Airtable, like this like toy of an app, basically, that was that people were having a lot of fun with. I think in the end, it was I just felt like I had to go with my gut a little bit with this one, and I just you know, as nice as it was to kind of like meet all those folks and touch technical stuff, which I still think is, you know, very, very important. I felt really connected to the mission and vision that Airtable was after. And that I think was the thing that pushed me over. And I was like, I just feel like I got to take a chance on this thing.
Now, given that you were not looking in that space particularly at all, I mean, what sort of attracted Airtable to you? I mean, I know you talked about sort of all the love that was shown, sort of organic love that you were seeing with the users and on Twitter and amongst VCs. But I think you had a story about how you were demoed the product a little bit, and you also went through some very interesting interviews. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about how you really came to believe in the product.
Yeah. The sequence is roughly like in our coffee chat with you know, myself and the CEO, we were at for those who live in SF, we were at the Westfield Mall downtown. Like we had some coffee shop on the main floor, and so we're like surrounded by all these people doing their shopping, and you know how he's going on about like the future of software creation. But effectively, what he had said was like, if you imagine all of the business software in the world, and you just like think about how similar they are when you boil it down, right? Like at the end of the day, for example, like Buffer, which is like the social media posting app, helps you post tweets at a certain schedule, right? It really boils down to 3 things. It's a form for you to type in a tweet. It's a thing in the back end that does all your scheduling for you. And then the third component is a piece of code that posts to Twitter via the Twitter API. Okay, what happens is if you decompose all the business software in the world out there into those blocks or those components, what if we just gave people those blocks themselves instead of trying to pre-configure an app for them, right? What if they could build their own buffer and then also use that same set to build whatever other software that falls under the same category, right? What ends up happening is that your business opportunity is like astronomical to the point where it's like not a useful number anymore, right? Like at this point, you're replacing swaths of business applications at a time. You're touching every knowledge worker on the planet. You're like all these different things. And it was just like, you get 0.1% of that and you have an amazing business. But as soon as you get into 1 or 2% of it, then all of a sudden you're talking literally about billions of dollars in revenue. And just philosophically, I think I love the idea too of just like not assuming that people have to accept whatever a developer gives them, right? That people are smart enough and creative enough to take that set of Lego blocks and go build something that is their own and their own version of that thing, and they can make changes and own the thing over time. So when I heard that, I was like, that feels real to me, right? Like there's just a sense of like an appeal to creativity that I could feel there. And I got invited to meet the team the following week, and so I went and did lunch and had some demos and everything. And now called Airtable Apps was originally called Airtable Blocks in the very beginning. We have maybe 40 or 50 of those published today. And I remember the first time there were 2 engineers, Kazar and JB, who showed me 1.5 blocks, the first 2. And I remember I was like, all right, these guys are like, it's a 15-person company, but it's like that approach is real that they talked about, right? It's not just this thing that they were going after in theory or whatever. You see this in some other products where they started in something and then now they're chasing after coincidentally the same sort of vision that I just painted for you, right? But they were doing that from the very beginning, and it was real. And I thought that if they were laying the foundation for that sort of approach now, and it was so sort of instrumental to their approach, I thought it was going to be something really fun to witness. And at the same time, I just got a really deep sense that the people there were equally committed, and they like really felt the mission down to their bones. Like every single person could articulate that argument and sort of the vision for the future. You put all those things together and it's really hard to say no, right? You have something you believe in, and you have this like something that really resonates with you and your own personal experience. And then you also have a group of people who equally get it and they're willing to work with you really hard to go after it. It's sort of a no-brainer when you put it that in those terms.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, I don't know if people here have had the chance to sort of scroll through Airtable's marketplace and universe, on their site. It's like dizzying, the iterations that you see. So it's interesting here. You talk just about that first and a half building block, that started that. But I want to kind of return to your sort of personal experience, so you're a consultant. I mean, how did you feel? We actually had a question from the audience. How did you feel about sort of translating those consulting skills into your role, and how did that beginning stages of your development go at Airtable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I have to say that I wasn't very prepared for whatever it ended up being, right? Like I had no idea. I feel like the early days of a company are so dramatically different than everything else that it really is hard for you to know, unless you've been watching someone else do it for a very long time, what it's actually going to feel like on day one, right? It is like, it is such a challenging balance of working on the right things, like working at a strategic level, but then also doing the tactical work, thinking long term, but then also making sure you take care of your day to day, like doing the work versus planning the work, like all those things. You have to just strike the right balance seemingly every single day. And I didn't do that right. Like, I'll be honest, I came in and I was like, oh, there is just so much work to do. And I just went for it. And it took me quite a while for me to realize that, like, no, the most impact I can make is not just by being another person in the machine and trying to like get as much of the work done. Like, there's a part of it where you have to realize that the company is only 1 to 2% along this pathway that it's going to walk, right? And you can do great within that 1 or 2% that you're covering, but you also have to realize that like you could also be thinking about like how to make the most of the remaining 98 to 99%, right? And that I think is what a lot of people miss, especially people who are more junior in their careers, like I was. I mean, I was like 23 when I started Airtable, right? I just didn't know that, right? But what I think the thing that helped was that consulting and these sorts of all those business training jobs that you start out with, like consulting or banking, whatever. It at the very minimum teaches you to not freak out. And you can handle a bunch of all these different things, like in those jobs you just have a wide variety of people who are pressing you in all these different ways, and at the end of it you're just like, yeah, I can handle that. Like I can kind of go toe to toe with all these folks and juggle a bunch of different things and change context in your mind very, very quickly. It also helps you approach problems in a very specific way, right? It is about like, all right, now that you've learned to not freak out, how do you take advantage of your ability to stay calm and disassemble the problem in front of you into something that is like more achievable, right? And so that ended up being very useful for me as well. Is like, okay, like when I actually got the time to think, then it's like, okay, like what is the sequence of questions that I need to be asking myself in order to get the best answers out of the time that I'm spending.
Yeah, I think this these remarks are speaking to a lot of people. I mean, because I assume a lot of people come from a consulting background, but I would sort of step back and say, I think in professional client services in general, you've highlighted both a kind of negative and a pro to being in that field. The negative being that you tend to be a line worker, right? You put your head down and you put in the hours, no matter what. And the clients are dictating everything you do, and the deadlines are dictated by the clients, and in my case, the courts, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, I mean, you put in so much of that work, you like kind of know how to do anything that gets thrown at you. So that's super interesting,
Absolutely, that's a great way to put it.
I want to also sort of, highlight that, Pete recently tweeted a kind of thread about his sort of, well, it wasn't actually specifically about you. So that's kind of what I want to point out. He tweeted a thread about what he would have done differently if he had been an early employee at an early stage startup. It got a lot of retweets, et cetera. And I think it's interesting because you have kind of a personal backstory. I feel like that goes with the list of things you had there. And I think this is you touched on one of them, right? You were sort of burning the midnight oil and just doing a whole bunch of hard work because there was just so much stuff to do, and you sort of felt like you had to transform that a little bit into thinking more strategically.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you could tell us sort of in terms of detail, like give us some examples, what you were doing back then in the sort of early year or early months even, I don't know, and now looking back you're like, maybe it could have been different.
Yeah. Great question, Stan. Effectively, like I think, we can, dig up that thread or something, but in essence, there were a bunch of individual kind of adages that I now throw to people. But I think the most important of them is to always carve out time to think, right? And for any person who can kind of just pick up the right mental model, it actually is not that hard to figure out kind of like the most important thing to do, right? The kind of ironic thing about an early stage company is that because you have so many other companies to learn from that are much bigger than you, sometimes the hardest thing is not figuring out what the end state looks like, right? Which you kind of like, what the best practices are. It's just the hard part is actually just getting it done, right, in the most effective way. Like to give an example of what the week looked like and what I would have changed, like Mondays and Tuesdays, we turned on this campaign. We use a product called Intercom, which allows you to, it has like a little widget in the bottom right, and then you can do things like, oh, when this person hits this page, like show a message, and then also allow them to write back. And then therefore you have sort of like a customer support type of experience, right? We turned on a campaign on Mondays and Tuesdays between myself and Shawnee, the first full-time CSM, that literally said like, Like literally, like, do you need any help? Like the most vague thing that begged for just any sort of interaction whatsoever, just to kind of get a sense of what the users were going through, right? And so we turned that on, and we would each get 120 support tickets a day on Mondays and Tuesdays. So here's the schedule of my day. From 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., I was cranking out support tickets, clearing out the inbox of 120, because it's not just 120 tickets, 120 conversations, right? So it's like all these back and forth, 120 different kinds of people. From 8 to 8:30, I had dinner. From 8:30 to 11, I was doing work with some of our enterprise customers. From 11 to 12:30, I was working on building our CRM in Airtable, and then from 12:30 to 2, I was working on legal documents with our salesperson. Rinse and repeat Monday through Thursday, and then Friday was like taking a break at like 6 or 7 p.m. Right? There is no time to think in that schedule, right? You have no idea kind of like what tomorrow is going to look like when you're struggling to even get through today, right? So what would have changed is that like you have to like it is just a different frame of mind that you have to be in, right? Like you have to just think about, like, it's really easy to say and understand now, but it's effectively like, if I'm answering 120 support tickets a day, why, first of all? And also, what does the future of that look like, right? Really what happens is we turn on that campaign because we fundamentally believe that talking to someone is because Airtable is so horizontal of a product, that experience is a very helpful way for users to get activated on the product. Okay, then the future of this is that we need to create potentially a team that is very engaged in the onboarding phase for a new user, that their entire job is just to get people onboarded in like a very superhuman, human in a loop type of fashion. Okay, what does that team look like? And how do we build that team? How do we move that problem forward, right? Then you're in the mindset of how does this problem look a year down the road, not struggling to keep up with the day-to-day and letting the actual problem fester, right? Because what's going to happen is that the product is going to go, now every person is stocking 200 tickets a day, 200 conversations a day, still without a plan of like what the future of this problem actually looks like, right? And so that's the frame of mind, right? Like there were so many of these things where at least, especially in the first 6 months, I was just focusing on operating and trying to do the work. And it took a very long time for me to get actually switched in that mindset of like, okay, how do I fix this so that we can actually build some repeatability into this, and it's not just relying on me going the extra mile to get the work done.
Yeah, that's a super great insight. I believe one of the tidbits you had was to sort of focus on building, not operating. I feel like that touches on that last point you were just talking about. And Jen had a good point, being reactive is extremely costly. So it takes a lot of time. That schedule sounds terrible, but let me just add that sounds most terrible for your attorney, since you're working on your legal docs from midnight to 2 a.m. That's messed up, man. That's not
we didn't
cool.
have counsel at the time, so nobody knew.
Awesome. We had a lot of questions. I think you touched actually upon a couple of the questions, so let me move on a little bit here. Tell me a little bit about some of the successes, right? So we talked about burnout a little bit and trying to pivot and how difficult that was. And tell me a little bit about in that first year or two, what you thought was most helpful, either to you personally or for the business strategically. I think either would be interesting for us.
Yeah, what I in the same vein of kind of the origins of me finding Airtable on Twitter and seeing all this love, like it was really cool to see what we were doing as that small of a team, just getting into all these companies that were, I don't think we had any business being there, but it worked, right? And I mean, I'm seeing Kali's question on some user groups that you want to focus on, right? We had the most scrappy thing that I think we ever did in terms of working with customers is that we had set up a tool internally. Our CEO wrote this himself, called Slinterbit, which is a combination of Slack, Intercom, and Clearbit. So the sequence was a user signs up on Airtable. we take that profile, a piece of code takes that user's email and puts that into Clearbit. Clearbit searches for their profile online, like who they are, like what company they work for, what type of function they're in, their seniority. They try to enrich that data. And for every match, we then take the profile and we post it in Slack. And so this is running feed in Slack of every single sign up that we've ever gotten. Basically, there's like literally millions of messages in that channel now. And there's also a button that was called a claim follow-up. And so there was some tag in Intercom that would then try to send them a message or whatever. And so what we would do, our earliest customer success motion was literally would just sit in that channel and watch that feed and look for patterns of companies that were coming through in teams. So it could be, oh, like this retail company is, I remember seeing them a few times in this feed this week, or there's this software company. Oh, I think that they had like 5 signups in the last hour or something like that. And we were like trying to keep a mental tabulation of which accounts were coming through. But we would email them. Like we would say like, hey, just like, want to introduce myself and kind of see what you're doing with the product and everything. And real credit to Shani, the first CSM, those accounts are our biggest accounts today. Like they went from on the order of like 1 or 2 or a few people back in late 2016 before I joined to early 2017 and everything, to literally thousands of users, all because of that, right? And what was really fun was seeing that happen. It always felt like we were punching above our weight. Especially in the first 2.5 years that I was there, it always felt like we were in conversations that we were not supposed to be having. And that's really, really fun. Because at the end of the day, you knew that like, it just felt like there's a sense of just satisfaction that like the bet that you made on the product back then was actually playing out. And for me, I was like, all right, yeah, I felt like I had a pick here that worked out. So that was something that was really empowering the entire time, was just like, no matter what the workload was and how many different types of people we were talking to, it was really empowering to see us cover so much and really validate just how much opportunity there was on the table.
Super interesting. Speaking of segmentation and sort of the types of looking for patterns in users, were you guys looking for anything other than sort of big whales? I mean, were there any surprising patterns that you saw that you sort of chased after and that came to fruition in an interesting way?
Yeah, I mean, there weren't any. I mean, I think all the patterns we chased on pure business opportunity front were all pretty self-explanatory. So we obviously tried to talk to as many big companies as we could. We tried to talk to as many marketing people as we could, because we noticed that was an early trend. All that, but I think the fun part was seeing the odd use cases come in, both good and bad. And so the one that we always talk about publicly is cattle ranchers. But the full story was that we noticed that there was a surprising amount of in the early days of cattle ranchers using the product, and that's because we had effectively displaced a point solution called CattleMax, which was effectively like a database with some like terrible UI slapped on it that was like meant to track your cattle. And I think someone just recreated that software, which I did a couple other times for some other use cases. And they published the template, and all of a sudden, like all these other cattle ranches were using the same template. And all of a sudden, like now we're like the market leader for like cattle tracking software, cattle management, I guess. So it's like you find those things, and like this was a couple years in, but like AOC's office started to use Airtable and still does today, I think, and it's like just really fun to see them post Airtable links. And we have another Slack channel that has all of our Twitter mentions, so people sharing AOC's posts about like, oh, if you want to work in my office, like here's the Airtable form to go do that. That's really cool. But it also raises some serious questions that I think like still affect a lot of way larger companies, right? Like even today, we're less than 300 people, and way earlier than that, we've already had to deal with some of these more existential questions, right? One of them is like, we found, concerningly enough, like in our Twitter feed, we would see people who were posting things like, hey, here's an Airtable base of all of the mosques in Australia.
Yes, I was gonna ask you about this. Yeah.
That's a crazy thing to see on the inside. You're like, oh my God, like I have no idea how to deal with this, right? Like, and so like I don't quite remember the specifics. I think it just got escalated to a point where I was no longer involved. But that's also the issue with these sort of horizontal products, right? It's like all of a sudden we're dealing with like nefarious use cases that really wouldn't have ever imagined. But all that is like, it's really interesting to kind of see it happen, and to experience the, it's like, you remember your first lawsuit, I guess. Like if you were, like, I was talking to a coworker today, and he used to be at Dropbox, and he said like, yeah, I was involved in some like lawsuit, and that was just felt really weird. And I'm like, yeah, no, I totally get what you mean. It's just like a very
Yeah.
strange situation to be in.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about this because I have a little bit of interest in these like kind of moderation issues. But the I guess the pro of having these templates so public, and I feel like it's part of your brand and part of the marketing strategy to have this sort of blasted out everywhere and have all these interesting use cases for the
Yeah.
public to see. I mean, if you Google Airtable, people, like, you scroll down enough and you'll see a publication called the Gem State Producer. It's written by the Idaho Farm Bureau. And on page 16 of that publication is some dude, talking about how he found Airtable. And there's like a little QR code where you can sort of find the template, I think, something like this. It's incredible, so that's the positive side of it. But, unlike Google Docs, where we can plan terrorist activities, at least somewhat in secret, you have this sort of public facing, a version of Airtable just floating around. So it has some of these odd issues. What if people start posting like crazy stuff,
Yeah.
like the mosque thing that you mentioned? That's super interesting.
Yeah, it kind of tied into, I mean, we never had this problem with Airtable Universe, but that was something that we just wanted to make sure. I mean, we didn't really have to like say anything about it because, we were moderating everything, but well, we were curating the gallery. So effectively, like in late 2017, the latter half of 2017, we launched something called Airtable Universe, which is like a publicly available, it's kind of like our template gallery, except it's like real use cases published by actual Airtable users, right? And so we didn't have that moderation issue, but this sort of gets into just like where sharing comes into play, because like it is sort of important to have people talking about these use cases that you don't really imagine out of the software, but like somehow showing that that's possible, right? Like one of the core issues with Airtable is that when you first open it up, you'll see something that looks like Google Sheets, and then you'll just think it's Google Sheets on steroids, and it's like not that. It's like much bigger than that, right? Although the design to make it look like Google Sheets is like somewhat deliberate, like it does restrict your understanding of the product a little bit, right? And so we like we made this effort in 2017 to produce a bunch of templates and then open up Airtable Universe, specifically for the purpose of just like showing what's possible, right? Originally, the thesis was like, okay, if you can't get people to understand like how they can use Airtable, then you just got to show them a bunch of examples, and then they'll get it, right? It was, I think it's still a very, very great asset, and I think it's a miss if we don't have that today. But actually, the problem with that is it gets to the point where if we view Airtable bases as full-on software applications, there is sort of like, just because you saw like that someone had built something with Airtable does not mean that like you therefore are now prepared to do that, right? Like the education is different from marketing, right? And so what happened was people would duplicate these templates, and they're like, I have no idea what to do with this still, right? And so they're trying to like they found a template that's like 80% there, and then they just don't know how to make the last 20% modification to make it fit their process. But that's really important, right? Because that's the whole point of the product, is to allow them to configure the product so that it does fit like 100% to their business process.
Yeah, you got to build the engine to know, sort of to be able to tinker with it afterwards, right?
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. Yeah. So it kind of, this strikes at our one of the core issues that will determine a large part of Airtable's success in the next few years. Is we haven't solved this today, right? But like effectively the problem boils down to, and this affects every company that is working on a platform, like ServiceNow has a platform offering and all these sorts of things, is like there are two types of kids in the world. Like there are kids where if you place them in a sandbox, they will know exactly how they have fun in that sandbox, right? There's another type of kid where like they get in this sandbox and like, I have no idea what the sand is and how this is like going to be good for me, and right? And so like some people know exactly what to do when they hop in Airtable. They know exactly the use case. They have like this motivation to learn. They have a motivation to build, and they will go after it, right? And these are these creative personalities that have honestly built the success of Airtable and other applications like it so far. The challenge is reaching the much greater population that doesn't know, right? Isn't motivated to independently learn how to use and configure the application and build something like that, right? At the end of the day, right, this like the proof that like this will have to change goes all the way back to Salesforce. Like most people don't know that Salesforce, like today, is Sales Cloud, Marketing Cloud, Commerce Cloud, like all these different individual applications. But what people don't know is that Salesforce started as Force.com. Force.com was a platform, right? If anybody uses Salesforce, literally the URL today, I'm looking at my screen now to see what it is. Like mine, for example, says airtable.lightning.force.com. It doesn't say salesforce.com. Force.com is their no-code platform. This has existed previously. But what happened was they likely figured out that people don't know what the hell to do with force.com, right? And so what they did was, okay, we need to figure out how to pre-configure some version of force.com that solves an individual use case, that makes it eminently clear why this thing is important. And so that's how you come to Sales Cloud, Marketing Cloud, Sustainability Cloud, all these different use cases. It's because at the end of the day, when you're buying, you have to figure out what the value is as the buyer, right? And with a platform that is like so horizontal, covers so many use cases, it's really hard for you to communicate that, right? Either during the sales process, you have to translate, like we have to literally build Airtable bases for our customers in order to show them the value of it, like to show a demo, or you come in with a prepackaged version of it that is marketed very narrowly at that particular use case or function.
Yeah. No, I mean, that's super interesting. I think you talked about this with me when we talked before about sort of how this plays a role in the role that you've transitioned to. So I'd love to sort of step back a little bit and sort of maybe you could describe to us how you went from ops to being a growth PM and being interested, I think, in this specific problem that you're talking about right now. But correct me if I'm wrong. Could you tell us a little bit about that journey? Yeah.
Yeah, it's actually a very recent journey. It's like in the last few months I've had this discussion. I mean, basically, like I had been working on the revenue side, which is like completely divorced from the product side for so long. It seems like people want me to talk about college discussion. I'll get to after. Basically, like we're building the go-to-market side so independently from the product side, and only in this year where we've started to have more integration between the two. I just, I'd been working on the topic for so long. I was like, I just wanted to see if I can like try something new, right? And it turns out that our growth team is the perfect way to do that, because growth product teams are more, activation focused or revenue focused or whatever it might be, which I think is just what I'm more tuned to anyways. Like I like building businesses more than I like building products. But product is one way to build a business, right? Coincidentally, our growth team has a portion of it that we call the high touch pod, which is effectively, like, I guess in the 1 to 2 year timeframe, going to be the engine and product counterpart to the revenue side of the organization, right? So in the lens of kind of continuing this high touch support thing that we talked about earlier, we have a team called our onboarding specialist team, which is their entire job is to literally just get people on the phone to talk them through the product and explore their use case for them, right? Because we know it boosts activation, and now we're at the stage where we just want as many people to talk to that team as we possibly can, right? And so now we have this, the side of the product org that is looking to drive interactions with the customer facing side, and I just so happen to be the person who like has enough context to bridge the gap between the two, and so therefore like it made sense for me to try PMing some of the efforts there.
Now, did this transition have to, you talked in the beginning, I think this goes to Callie's question. Although Callie, if you want to speak, do you want to ask your question? I'm cool with that. What do you think? Callie. No, maybe not, but it's okay.
Go ahead. You got it.
Okay. All right. I got it. So, I think it goes to, she was sort of asking you, sort of once you realized, whoa, I need to step back and start building process and think about scalability and think more strategy than sort of day-to-day 120 support tickets type of thinking. You had to step back. And how did that transition go for you? Did you have conversations with your managers? Was it rough? Was it smooth? And is that related to why you wanted to sort of transition into the growth PM role, or no?
A little bit, yeah. So part of Kali's question is like, how do you manage other people's, like, how do you change what they view of you, right? Like, do you ever get trapped as an IC or get pigeonholed as this IC, like this super IC, right? To be honest, like for a good portion of it, I did get pigeonholed as like a super IC that was just like capable of slightly more output than the average person, right? And that, said a little reductively, right? But effectively the case. At the end of the day, this is a management problem, right? This is a people management problem. If you have a bad manager, they will always, they will not be able to like pull you out of that situation just because they don't recognize that that's what's happening, right? The good managers will come and be like, oh, hold on. Like, especially if they're new, they'd be like, this seems wrong. This just seems wrong that you have someone who like, like high potential or high capacity or whatever the barometer is, and saying like, okay, but they're stuck doing this thing. Like, how do we get them out of that and not just do more important things, right? And so I was fortunate to work with a few managers who were all like that, and we're like, okay, no, like, as important as this was, and as we had a period where we like had a directive to not hire in 2018 for one reason or another, it effectively meant that I was trapped kind of doing all that work and just holding on to it, right? But it takes someone to like a good manager to help bring that out and just be like, okay, no, like we do need to hire because like, hey, look, like if Pete goes on vacation, we're screwed as business for XYZ reasons, right? Which happened at some point, because I think like I went away for like 2 weeks and came back and it was just like this flood of like what happened that had transpired while I was gone. And so like, I think it's really hard to, and this I think is why, like, I think the first 3 to 6 months, especially if you're on the precipice of, management and those sorts of things, like it actually does matter in terms of how you approach the problem, right? Are you the person that's going to come in knowing that you're going to own a problem and immediately try to tackle it, or present a plan on what resources you need to tackle it, right? The first one is the IC, the second one is the manager. Yep. And I actually observed this a couple of other times in the Airtable org, where there were people that did both, and the outcomes there in terms of just like things like perception and the resourcing available to them and the access that they had to tackle the problems, like changed materially, purely depending on the approach that they had in the first 3 months.
Super, super interesting. Do you feel like you'll take on more of a strategy role with your growth PM hat?
Oh yeah, this has changed like dramatically. I guess like for me, it was very much like in the first year and a half, where it was like just trying to do a bunch of work. But since then, there was we had hired effectively we had like a VP of our customer engagement is like all of our is like sales, customer success support. So like she came in, and then she like was pulling me out of stuff, and a change manager a couple times. They were all pulling me out of stuff. So that period is long gone. But to your question, like yeah, the growth role will be even more of that, right? Because now it's you know, product is special just because the product and eng side has so much more leverage in every action that they take. That it's just a fundamentally different sort of scale of thinking. Like I you know, in the last couple of months, just I never really had a sense of how many people looked at the Airtable.com homepage, and then they were throwing out numbers of like, you know, tens of millions. I'm like, how do you even like? I'm used to working with like 200 deals like in a sales pipeline every quarter. Like that's the scale of like data that I work with, and now they're talking about like tens of millions. It's just like a fundamentally different type of thinking because of the leverage that they have.
Mm-hmm. Do you feel like do you manage people now? And has
no.
No, you don't.
Yeah, sorry, the rest of your question.
No, that's fine. If it was a no, there wasn't a rest of my question.
Yeah. I'm basically operating as an IC PM on the growth team right now. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we have 10 minutes, and I kind of want to get kind of rapid fire miscellaneous questions because there's been a bunch I've skipped over. You know, let's go way off side here and tell us what SF Public Library. What's going on? What's going on, bro?
Yeah, so I'm one of 7 commissioners for the San Francisco Public Library. So I mean, most city agencies in SF has a corresponding commission for like, you know, resident representation and the public and all that kind of stuff. But I mean, the reason I got involved is because I wanted to do something that like very closely impacted my community, as in my like local neighborhood and just like the city itself, knowing that there are obviously many types of communities. And I, you know, I think a lot of people in my cohort and tenure will look at, you know, they'll do a junior board or an associate board of a nonprofit. And I was like, oh, I'm just not a fan of that, because I think in many of them are not set up to do really impactful work. You just end up hosting a few events and you just end up tapping your own network for fundraising, you know, which has value. It's not the type of work that I wanted to be doing. But I love the library, and the library I think is just like so cool and just so much, right? Like it's like the role of the library is changing so much, and it is like people are talking about the library as a physical space, which has, you know, never really been part of it before. They're talking about as a gateway to a certain amount of content, which has not really been the case before. It is in some counties and states, it is it is like a place to access tools, like using computers because they don't have internet at home, like you know, hardware tools because they're using it for trade work and learning a new skill or whatever, and they don't have another outlet to do that, right? It's like plugging so many holes in the sort of public infrastructure that normally just have not been part of the equation. Like the whole idea of going to a librarian and just asking them for you know, recommendations on a certain topic is like still there, but it's like by far, like it's definitely not the primary use case anymore. Anyways, I started going to library commission meetings in SF in early 2018, I think, and nobody goes to those. It's like horrendously inconvenient for you to go to those. It's like a third Thursday at like 4:30 p.m. In Civic Center. And it's like, who's going to take off? Like, luckily I had a job that like actually allows me to do that because they were flexible on scheduling. So I would go, and I would be the only one who wasn't making like just really negative comments about the library. It was like these 2 guys that show up every single time and make very, very negative comments about things. Such Debbie Downers. And I would just go after them and be like, I think you guys are doing great. Like, like I like this thing, I like this thing, I like this thing. And you know, like was just able to offer some good ideas. And then Mayor Breed won the election in June of 2018, and then a few months after that, the commission had 2 open seats, and so her staff had reached out and wanted to see if I wanted to get on the other side of the podium. So it's in an auditorium, commission's on stage, everyone's in the audience, so I just took my seat on stage instead of in the audience seats.
Oh my God, I love this story. I mean, if there's one thing we all need to take away from this get together, is that you got to be the type of person that goes to freaking public commission, library commission meetings for fun. Just honestly, to praise them too, not to complain.
yeah. I mean, look, I think there's a couple takeaways. Like one, I'd always, I think people who work for the city are just like a different breed of people, and they're just like such good people. I think, especially the librarians. I've like never met a group of people who will go the extra 100 miles just for one single person to ask for something. Like they will do that, right? The second thing is this was in 2017, where like I had earlier in the year had remarkable success with this attitude of just trying to walk in the front door and see what happens, right? Like I literally just cold emailed our CEO to see if I could talk to him. I was like, let me just try this other thing where I just literally walk in the door with the library commission and see what happens to get engaged. And like, it's kind of remarkable what happens, because I think San Francisco in tech in general is a little bit more open, but you can get a lot farther than you think. Like there's actually very few, I think, arenas where people will actively try to preclude you from doing that. I think the difficulty just sometimes finding what the right door is, but like you can, through that, I've talked to Gavin Newsom because of that. Like I've met a lot of the city politicians because like these people are just there, and you just gotta like go up to them and talk to them, and it's like completely fine. So it's like those types of things where I'm like, especially in 2017, I was like, let me just see what happens if I just just take the most direct path and then see what happens with it.
Nice, I love it. That's an amazing story. Okay, random questions. Tell me something that you love about Airtable culture. Unique, special to you, just something you like.
Everyone has a random thing up their sleeves, and I can't tell still if this is like an Airtable thing or like a tech company thing. But lunch was always the best thing, because maybe now it's different because we were just like
lunch is always the best thing.
We hired like 100 people in the last 6 months, so like the company has materially changed this year through COVID. So it might be different when we go back, but like in person, lunch was just about random stuff. It was just always the most random stuff, and so people, someone read a book on the business of Broadway, and so they were teaching us about how like literally 2 or 3 companies own all the major Broadway theaters, and like their business model behind running shows, and how they produce them and buy the rights and all that kind of stuff, to someone who talked about like these crazy hiking adventures that they go on, to someone who has this niche knowledge in a very like niche area of the world, right? Like that.
It's kind of like RenCo, man.
Yeah, totally. It is. Airtable has always, like, I've interviewed so many people over the course of my Airtable experience, and we always had trouble defining what like Airtable-iness is. But like the core of it really is like, and we always left that dimension as called Airtable, like how Airtable are they? And really it comes down to like 3 factors, which is like that they approach with kindness first, that they're always just like very like, they're not kind of coming in and just trying to enforce their idea and just like, I know everything and I'm just here to fix the shit for you, and like you all owe me something. And then the second thing is that they always consider the possibility that they're wrong. And the third thing is that they're just naturally very curious people. And so therefore you take all those people and you put them together and you have just like really awesome conversations about the most random things in the world.
Amazing. We have 2 minutes. I have one question. Okay, it was my planned last question. I actually wanted to ask you about how your team uses Airtable themselves for their work. But instead of asking about that, I just want to ask you, if you were to create your own base just for fun, what would it be?
I were to create my own base. Oh, I've done that so many times.
But like for yourself, for some
Yeah.
weird personal project. Yeah.
Yeah, funnily enough, this is a little dramatic, but I actually don't use Airtable in my personal capacity. I actually like
Yes.
much prefer to use like text lists. I literally like have in Sublime Text a file open, like a TXT file with a bunch of bullet points I can share everyone offline, and that's how I prefer to manage my stuff. But like the base to get crazy because like now the problem with that is that it's put me out of practice in building bases. There was a time when I knew every single combination and use case and all the tricks and all that kind of stuff. You could do like crazy things. And then they started adding apps and automations. I was like, oh God, like this is where I lose the thread a little bit. And there are things now where people will literally like, we have a button field in Airtable which did not exist before. It's like literally a button. Imagine a button in a Google sheet, like, and literally like if you have a list of projects, they will now click a button and it will create a Slack channel. It'll email all the stakeholders. It will resource appropriately. It will assign people to tasks. It will set up like all these meetings for them, like literally just with one button. And that it was just like so different than like what I'd originally like known about the product,
Yeah.
right? So like the use cases just keep on getting more and more insane.
Yeah.
Anyways, yeah.
Awesome.
I'm sorry I don't have a fun answer for you.
No worries. We are out of time, so I just have to thank everyone. I'm so sorry for missing everyone's question. It's because I'm a terrible moderator and I can't read that fast. But thank you everyone for your time. Thank you, Pete, so much. We enjoyed the personal stories and the insights into the company. And thanks, Jen, for hosting us. Oh, and everyone submit feedback, please.
Yeah,
Thank
I'm gonna send
you.
out a feedback form tomorrow morning. Pete and Stan would love your feedback. And if there's anything we can do to improve these events, we'd love to hear from you. Thank you, guys.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.
Good night, Pete.
Night.